All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that's really pretty amazing when you think about it.
Absolutely.
Amateur radio repeaters. So, if you're someone who likes to understand how things work, especially when it comes to technology and communication,
Right.
this is going to be a really fascinating look at how these repeaters can take a signal and really amplify it and stretch it way beyond what you might think is possible.
Yeah. It really is incredible the way these things work. And we've got some great info here to dive into what repeaters are all about
Yeah.
and why they make such a big difference.
Yeah, and for our listeners who really like to cut to the chase
Uh-huh.
and get that information quickly and efficiently,
Absolutely.
think of this as your express lane to understanding these amateur radio repeaters
There you go.
without having to dig through a bunch of complicated manual.
No manuals required.
So what we're going to do today is break down exactly what these amateur radio repeaters are and why they are so incredibly useful. Not just for the hobbyists out there who enjoy ham radio, but also in those really critical emergency situations
Yeah.
that you might not have even considered.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to touch on the different types of repeaters that are out there and give you a sense of, what they might cost.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's jump right in. When you hear the term repeater, what exactly is this thing doing? It sounds kind of complicated, but at its heart, what's the basic idea?
Well, when you think about it, it's not that complicated at all. Basically, a repeater is an electronic device, and its job is pretty straightforward.
Okay.
It listens for a radio signal on a specific frequency, and then it retransmits that same signal,
Mm-hmm.
but on a different frequency.
Huh.
And that simple act of retransmission, that's the key to really extending how far that communication can travel.
So it's kind of like a booster or a relay point for radio signals, right?
Exactly. You got it.
And I've always heard that these repeaters are placed in really high locations, like on top of hills or tall buildings. Why is that? Why is that elevation so important?
It's all about maximizing that repeater's effectiveness.
Mm.
When it's up high, whether it's a hilltop, a mountain, even a skyscraper,
Yeah,
that repeater gets a much wider line of sight,
right.
so it can cover a much larger area. And being up high, it can pick up weaker signals from radios that maybe don't have a lot of power,
Okay.
and then it broadcasts them out much stronger and further.
So let's say I'm using my handheld radio and I want to talk to someone far away, maybe in another town.
Uh-huh.
My little handheld probably can't reach that far directly, right? Especially if there's stuff in the way. So the repeater helps bridge that gap.
You got it. If you can't see the other person's antenna, chances are your handheld's not going to reach them.
Right.
The Earth's curvature, buildings, hills, all those things get in the way. A repeater placed up high basically jumps over those obstacles. It's essential for any communication beyond a short distance.
So we've got that extended range. That's a huge benefit. But I know our notes also mention improved signal quality. So how does a repeater take my signal, which might be kind of fuzzy or weak, and make it clearer for the person on the other end? How does that magic happen?
Well, the magic is really a combination of that high location and the repeater's own powerful transmitter.
Okay.
It takes your signal, which might be weak and noisy,
Mhm.
and rebroadcasts it from that high vantage point with more power.
Okay.
It's like the repeater has a much better antenna and a much stronger voice.
That's
How it clears things up and makes your message much easier to understand on the other end.
So it's not just broadcasting further, it's broadcasting better.
Precisely.
And that brings us to a really important point. When we think about emergencies, when things go wrong, radio communication is often absolutely critical. So how do these amateur radio repeaters fit into that picture?
Well, doing natural disasters, power outages, any kind of crisis situation,
Ah.
repeaters become absolutely essential.
Okay.
They act as these vital communication hubs, not just for the emergency services like police and fire departments,
Right.
but also for the vast network of amateur radio operators who often volunteer their time and skills to help out when regular communication systems go down.
It's like having this resilient backup communication network that can step in when those everyday channels fail.
Exactly. When cell phones are overloaded or just not working because the power's out, these repeater systems can keep those vital connections alive.
And it's not just about individuals talking to each other, right? These repeaters can do something called interoperability. Can you explain what that means and why it's so important, especially in an emergency?
Yeah, that's a really key feature. Repeaters can be linked together to form wider networks.
Okay.
So you might have groups of ham radio operators in different counties, even different states.
Wow.
And these link repeaters allow them to communicate seamlessly across those distances.
That's amazing.
It breaks down those geographical barriers, and it's especially important when you've got multiple agencies that need to coordinate during a big emergency.
So it's really about creating a network, not just isolated points of communication. And that's got to be a huge advantage for coordinating emergency responses.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's not just for emergencies, right? I know a lot of amateur radio clubs use these repeaters for other things, too.
Right, they use them to support all sorts of community events like marathons or public safety exercises, and of course they use them for disaster preparedness drills. It's really a proactive approach to community support.
Yeah, it really is. Now, when we talk about amateur radio repeaters, we're not talking about just one type of device, are we?
No, there are several different kinds of repeaters out there, and each one has its own strengths and purposes.
So let's break those down a bit.
Right.
What are some of the main types that people are using?
Well, the most common type is the analog FM repeater.
Okay.
It uses frequency modulation, the same technology as your FM radio, and it's known for clear voice communication.
Okay.
These are the workhorses of the amateur radio world, widely used for casual chats and emergency comms.
So that's kind of the basic go-to type. What about something a little more advanced? I see something here about digital repeaters.
Yeah, so digital repeaters use digital modulation techniques, things like DMR, D-Star, and System Fusion, and they offer some really neat enhancements. They can transmit data, not just voice, and they often have better audio quality and use the radio spectrum more efficiently.
Oh, so it's like moving from a basic phone call to being able to send text messages and files.
That's a good analogy.
Okay. And these different types of digital modulation, like DMR and D-Star, do they each have their own specialties?
Yeah, they do. DMR is known for being really efficient with bandwidth.
Okay.
D-Star can handle both voice and data, and System Fusion is designed to bridge the gap between analog and digital.
Cool. So there's a lot of options there. And then we have crossband repeaters, which sounds a bit more specialized.
They are a bit more specialized. Crossband repeaters can operate on two different frequency bands at the same time. For example, they might receive a signal on the VHF band and retransmit it on the UHF band, or vice versa.
And VHF and UHF, those are just different ranges within the radio frequency spectrum, right?
That's right.
And why would you want to do that? Why would you want to switch between bands like that?
Well, VHF and UHF have different characteristics.
Okay.
They travel differently. So using a crossband repeater lets you connect users who have equipment on different bands.
Ah, so it's like a translator between different radio languages.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, and then what about portable and mobile repeaters? Are those the kind that you would use in a temporary situation, like if you're responding to an emergency?
Exactly. Those are designed to be compact and easy to move around.
Okay.
You can set them up quickly in an emergency or at a special event where you don't have a permanent repeater.
So they provide a lot of flexibility.
They do.
And then finally, we have internet-linked repeaters. These sound really interesting because it's like taking radio waves and extending them out through the internet.
Yeah, it's a really cool technology. They use VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol, things like Echolink and IRLP, and that lets them connect to other repeaters or even individual users who are online anywhere in the world.
Wow, so I could be talking through a repeater here and someone on the other side of the planet could potentially join the conversation.
That's right.
That's pretty amazing. Now, all this amazing technology, it can't be free, right? So what's the general price range for these different types of repeaters?
Well, like most things, the price depends on the features and complexity. An entry-level analog FM repeater, which is a good starting point for a lot of clubs, might cost somewhere between $500 and $1,500.
Okay.
Mid-range digital repeaters with more advanced features are usually in the $1,500 to $5,000 range.
Got it.
And then the high-end multi-mode repeaters, those can handle a lot of different formats, analog and digital. They can run you anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000.
So there's quite a range there.
There is.
What about the portable ones and the internet-linked ones? Where do those fall?
Portable repeaters vary quite a bit, depending on how powerful they are and how rugged they need to be. But you're probably looking at somewhere between $300 and $2,000.
Okay.
Internet-linked repeaters, they usually fall somewhere in the middle, maybe $1,000 to $6,000. And that includes the equipment you need to connect them to the internet.
Right, so there's the cost of the repeater itself, but then there's all the other stuff that goes with it, the antennas, the power supplies, and the maintenance, right?
Exactly. You have to factor in those operational costs as well.
Yeah, it's not just the initial purchase price.
No, it's not.
So let's come back to that really crucial role that repeaters play in emergencies.
Okay.
Our sources really emphasize this point. What makes these repeaters so vital when it comes to emergency and crisis communication?
Well, they offer a level of reliability that you often don't get with traditional communication networks.
Okay.
Think about landline phones or the internet. Those can be really vulnerable during a disaster, right? Physical damage, power outages, network congestion, all those things can knock them out. Amateur radio repeaters are often much more dependable.
And I'm guessing that's partly because they're often independent systems and they have their own backup power. Right.
Exactly. A lot of repeater sites have generators or solar panels so they can keep running even if the power grid goes down.
That's huge.
It is. It's absolutely critical for maintaining communication when you need it most.
And then there's that wide area coverage that we talked about, being able to link emergency personnel, shelters, rescue teams across large areas.
Right.
That's got to be so important for coordinating those relief efforts.
Absolutely. And that interoperability we discussed earlier is a major advantage for emergency services too. It allows different agencies to communicate seamlessly.
Right, right.
And in some cases, these repeater networks are even integrated directly with public safety agencies, giving them an additional communication channel.
That's incredible.
It really is. It can be a lifeline in a complex emergency. And then you have the amateur radio clubs who maintain their own repeater networks specifically for disaster response. They train volunteers who can assist with rescue and recovery operations, providing extra support to the community when it's most needed.
It really shows how something that might seem like a niche hobby can actually be a really important part of a community's resilience.
It's a testament to the ingenuity and the community spirit within the amateur radio world.
So let's just quickly summarize what we've learned about amateur radio repeaters.
Right.
They're electronic devices that extend the range of communication for ham radio operators, and they improve the quality of the signal.
Right.
They do this by receiving and retransmitting signals from those high locations, and we've seen that they're not just important for long-distance communication, they're absolutely vital in emergencies, providing that reliable network when other systems fail.
Exactly.
We talked about the different types of repeaters, analog FM, digital, crossband, portable, internet linked, and we got a sense of the costs involved. Right. Which can range from a few $100s to several thousand.
And don't forget those ongoing operational costs.
Right, the antennas, the power, the upkeep, all of that.
Absolutely.
And I think it's really important to emphasize that role as a backbone for emergency communication, providing that independent infrastructure, the wide coverage, the backup power, and that connection to public safety networks and community-based response efforts.
You know, for our listeners, I think understanding this technology gives them a real appreciation for the unseen layers of communication infrastructure that are out there and how they can make a huge difference in a crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. It really highlights the ingenuity and the community spirit within the amateur radio world.
It does.
So I'm going to leave you with this thought. Imagine a scenario where all the usual ways of communicating, phones, internet, everything just goes down.
Okay.
Maybe there's a massive power outage or a major natural disaster. How would the presence of these amateur radio networks and repeaters, which often operate independently, how would that change things? How would that affect the outcome for individuals and communities?
It's a really important question to consider. It makes you think about the value of these alternative ways of communicating and how they can contribute to a community's resilience and preparedness.
Food for thought.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that wraps up our deep dive into amateur radio repeaters.
Great discussion.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
We'll catch you next time on